The dying sun painted the Arizona sky in fierce strokes of crimson and gold, as Josephine Nelson's wagon wheel shattered with a sickening crack. The sound echoed across the empty plains like a gunshot, sending birds scattering into the vast canvas above. She climbed down from the driver's seat, her navy traveling dress collecting dust as she knelt beside the broken wheel, knowing with sinking certainty that her journey to Clifton had just become considerably more complicated. The year was 1885, and the Arizona Territory was still wild enough to make a woman traveling alone a rare and dangerous proposition. Josephine had known the risks when she'd set out from Tucson 3 days prior, but necessity had overridden caution. At 24, with her schoolteaching position lost and her meager savings dwindling, the promise of work in Clifton's newly established schoolhouse had been too tempting to ignore. Now, as she assessed the damage to her wagon, that decision seemed foolhardy at best. The wheel hadn't merely come loose, the entire axle had cracked, rendering the wagon immobile. She straightened, brushing the dust from her skirts as she surveyed the surrounding landscape. The road to Clifton stretched before her, but the nearest settlement was at least 15 miles back, far too distant to reach on foot before nightfall. "Looks like you've got yourself in quite a predicament, madam." The deep voice startled her, and Josephine whirled around, her hand instinctively reaching for the small Derringer pistol concealed in her pocket. A man sat astride a chestnut stallion no more than 20 feet away, silhouetted against the blazing sunset. His face was shadowed beneath the wide brim of his hat, but she could make out broad shoulders and the unmistakable outline of a revolver at his hip. "Keep your distance, sir," she called, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I'm armed and know how to use it." The stranger chuckled, a low, warm sound that somehow eased her tension rather than heightening it. He raised both hands in a gesture of peace. "I believe you, madam, but I mean no harm, just offering assistance to a traveler in need." He dismounted with fluid grace, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. As he stepped forward, the dying light revealed a face weathered by sun and wind, yet youthful perhaps no more than 30 years. His eyes, a startling blue against his tanned skin, held her gaze with unexpected gentleness. "Blake Xanders, at your service," he said, tipping his hat. "I was heading to Clifton myself when I spotted your wagon." Josephine's grip on her hidden Derringer loosened slightly, though caution kept her wary. "Josephine Nelson," she replied, deciding that giving her name was a measured risk. "My wheel broke, as you can see." Blake approached the wagon, keeping a respectful distance from Josephine as he examined the damage. He crouched beside the broken wheel, his expression growing serious. "This isn't something that can be fixed on the trail, Miss Nelson." The axles split clean through. "Is there a settlement nearby?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Blake shook his head. "Nothing close enough to reach before dark, and these parts aren't safe for traveling at night." He glanced at the darkening sky, then back at her. "I'll stay till morning sees you safe. We can make camp here, and when daylight comes, I'll help you reach Clifton." Josephine studied him, weighing her limited options. Accepting help from a strange man went against everything her mother had taught her about propriety and safety. Yet the alternative, spending the night alone in the wilderness, seemed far more dangerous. "Why should I trust you, Mr. Xanders?" she asked plainly. His lips quirked in a slight smile. "Fair question. I can't give you much reason beyond my word, which I know isn't worth much to a stranger." He removed his hat, revealing hair the color of burnished copper in the fading light. "But my mother raised me to help those in need, especially ladies in distress. I'll keep my distance if it makes you feel safer, build my fire separate from yours." There was something earnest in his manner that compelled Josephine to believe him. Perhaps it was the clear, unwavering look in his eyes, or perhaps it was simply her desperate situation. "Very well, Mr. Xanders. I accept your offer of assistance." Relief visibly washed over his features. "Good decision, Miss Nelson. First thing is to get a fire going before it's fully dark." He moved toward his horse, untying a bedroll and saddlebags. "Do you have supplies in your wagon?" "Yes, enough for another 2 days. I have a small tent as well." "That's fortunate." "Let's get your things organized while we still have some light." They worked efficiently as dusk deepened around them. Blake gathered wood for a fire while Josephine retrieved her belongings from the wagon. As promised, he established his campsite a respectful distance from hers, though close enough to provide protection if needed. Soon, 2 small fires flickered in the growing darkness, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Josephine sat before her fire, watching as Blake tended to his horse before settling down at his own campsite. The initial fear she'd felt upon his arrival had subsided to wary appreciation. It was not the first time she'd had to rely on the kindness of strangers since her father's death 2 years prior, but it was certainly the most precarious situation she'd found herself in. "May I ask what brings you to Clifton, Miss Nelson?" Blake called across the distance between them, his voice carrying easily in the still night air. "I've accepted a position as the schoolteacher," she replied. "The town has built its first proper schoolhouse, and they were in need of someone with experience." "Ah, so you're the teacher they've been waiting for. The children will be glad to hear it. They've been using the church for lessons, but it's far from ideal." "You know Clifton well?" Josephine asked, curious about the town that was to be her new home. "Born and raised there," Blake replied. "My family runs the ranch just outside town, the Double X. I've been in Tucson for the past 3 weeks, delivering cattle and picking up supplies." This information reassured Josephine further. A man with roots and family was less likely to harbor ill intentions. "And your family is still in Clifton?" "My father and younger brother run the ranch with me. Mother passed 5 years ago." A note of sadness tinged his voice before he continued. "What about you? Do you have family waiting for your arrival?" "No," Josephine answered, gazing into the flames. "My father died 2 years ago. My mother when I was just a child. I was teaching in Tucson, but the school closed when funding was withdrawn. I saw the advertisement for Clifton and decided a fresh start was in order." "It takes courage to set out alone like that," Blake said, admiration evident in his tone. Josephine smiled ruefully. "Necessity often masquerades as courage, Mr. Xanders." Their conversation continued as they shared their evening meals, the space between their camps maintaining propriety while allowing for companionable discussion. Blake told her about Clifton, a growing mining town with a diverse population of miners, ranchers, and merchants. He spoke of the copper mines that had brought prosperity and people to the region, and of the challenges that came with such rapid growth. In turn, Josephine shared stories of her teaching experiences in Tucson, of the satisfaction she found in watching children discover the joy of learning. As the night deepened around them and the stars emerged in brilliant profusion, she found herself relaxing in the presence of this unexpected protector. "You should get some rest, Miss Nelson," Blake eventually suggested. "I'll keep watch for a while." Josephine hesitated. Despite the growing trust between them, sleeping in the open with a stranger nearby went against every conventional wisdom. Sensing her concern, Blake added, "I give you my word as a gentleman that you're safe with me. I'll stay right here by my fire." Something in his earnest expression convinced her. "Thank you, Mr. Xanders. I believe I will rest now." She retreated to her small tent, keeping the Derringer close at hand as she settled onto her bedroll. Outside, she could hear Blake moving quietly around his campsite. The rhythmic sound of his boots and the occasional soft words to his horse created an oddly comforting backdrop as exhaustion pulled her towards sleep. Her last conscious thought was that perhaps Providence, not misfortune, had guided her broken wagon to this particular stretch of road, under the watchful eye of Blake Xanders. Josephine woke with a start, momentarily disoriented in the darkness of her tent. The fire outside had died down to embers, casting a faint red glow through the canvas. She listened intently, trying to identify what had disturbed her sleep. The night was quiet except for the occasional call of a distant coyote and the soft shuffling of Blake's horse. Then she heard it again, the unmistakable crack of a twig breaking under weight. Someone or something was moving near the camp. Josephine reached for her Derringer, her heart pounding in her chest as she silently pushed back her blanket. "Easy there," came Blake's low voice from outside. "Just passing through, are we?" Another voice responded, gruff and unfamiliar. "Didn't mean to disturb. Saw your fire earlier. Thought I'd check if you might be willing to share some coffee come morning." Josephine held her breath, straining to hear the exchange more clearly. "That's mighty friendly of you to wait until the middle of the night to ask," Blake replied, his tone conversational but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Most folks would wait for daylight." "I'm not most folks." The stranger's voice hardened. "And I'm thinking you might have valuables worth more than coffee." Josephine's fingers tightened around her small pistol. She moved to the tent flap, carefully peering through a small gap. In the dim light of the dying fire, she could make out Blake standing with his back to her tent. Beyond him stood a figure tall and lean with a shotgun cradled in his arms. "I wouldn't recommend that course of action," Blake said calmly. "I'm traveling light and what I have isn't worth dying over." The man laughed, a harsh sound in the quiet night. "Big words from a man without a gun in hand." "Who says I need it in hand?" Blake's stance shifted subtly. "Now I'll ask you once to move along. There's a lady in that tent and I'd rather not have her sleep disturbed further." "A lady, huh?" The man's tone changed, interest and something more sinister coloring his words. "Well now, that does change things." Josephine felt ice flood her veins. She silently drew back the hammer of her Derringer, preparing to defend herself if necessary. What happened next occurred with such speed that Josephine barely had time to register the movement. Blake's hand dropped to his holster, drawing and firing in one fluid motion. The sound of the gunshot cracked through the night, followed immediately by a pained cry as the intruder stumbled backward, his shotgun falling to the ground. "I warned you," Blake said, his voice deadly calm as he kept his revolver trained on the man who now clutched his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. "That was intentionally high. The next one won't be." "You're mad," the man gasped. "Shooting a man over nothing. Nothing." Blake moved forward, kicking the fallen shotgun well out of reach. "You threatened a lady under my protection. Now you have two choices. Ride away and find a doctor for that shoulder, or push your luck and see how it ends." The wounded man staggered to his feet, hatred burning in his eyes. "This isn't over." "For your sake, it better be," Blake replied evenly. "Your horse is there. Mount up and ride out." Josephine watched, hardly breathing, as the would-be robber backed away, still clutching his wounded shoulder. He stumbled to where a horse was tethered in the shadows, awkwardly pulling himself into the saddle with a grunt of pain. With one last venomous glance at Blake, he wheeled the animal around and galloped away into the darkness. Only when the sound of hoofbeats had faded did Blake lower his revolver. He turned toward her tent. "Miss Nelson, are you all right?" Josephine emerged, still gripping her Derringer. Yes, she answered, her voice steadier than she felt. Thank you for handling that situation. Blake's face was grim in the dim light. I apologize for the disturbance. And for the violence. That wasn't how I hoped this night would go. There's no need to apologize, Josephine said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. You protected us both. She paused, then added, I suspect he wasn't just looking for coffee. A slight smile softened Blake's expression. No, I expect not. He glanced in the direction the intruder had fled. He's not likely to return, but I think we'd best keep watch for the remainder of the night. I'll stay up with you, Josephine decided, moving to rekindle her fire. I doubt I could sleep now anyway. Blake hesitated, then nodded. Very well, but let me tend the fire. You should conserve your strength for tomorrow's journey. They sat together beside the freshly built fire, the shared danger having erased some of the carefully maintained distance between them. Josephine found herself studying Blake's profile in the flickering light, the strong line of his jaw, the watchful intensity of his eyes as he scanned the darkness beyond their small circle of warmth. Have you always been so quick with a gun? She asked. Blake turned to look at her, surprise evident in his expression. Not something most ladies would ask about. I'm not most ladies, Josephine replied, echoing the intruder's earlier words but with a touch of humor. Besides, I believe your skill just saved my life. I'm allowed to be curious. Blake chuckled softly. Fair enough. No, I haven't always been quick. My father taught all his sons to shoot, but the speed came later. His expression grew distant. There was trouble in Clifton a few years back, a gang moving through the territory, robbing mines and ranches. They hit the double X hard. After that, I practiced every day until I could draw and fire without thinking. I'm sorry about your ranch, Josephine said softly. We rebuilt, Blake replied with a shrug. But I learned that in this territory, being able to defend what's yours isn't optional. He nodded toward the small pistol still in her hand. You seem prepared yourself. Josephine glanced down at her derringer. My father insisted I learn after he became ill, said a woman alone needs to be her own protector. She carefully secured the hammer and returned the pistol to her pocket. Though I admit I've never had to use it. Let's hope you never need to, Blake said sincerely. They fell into comfortable silence, both watching the flames dance while remaining alert to any sounds from the surrounding darkness. Eventually, Josephine found herself stifling yawns. You should try to sleep a little, Blake suggested. Dawn's still hours away and we have a long day ahead. What about you? Josephine asked. I'll keep watch, he assured her. I'm used to long nights on the ranch. Though reluctant, Josephine recognized the wisdom in his words. Wake me in a few hours, she instructed. You'll need rest as well. Blake agreed with a nod, though something in his expression told Josephine he had no intention of waking her. She returned to her tent, leaving the flap open this time so she could see the fire and Blake's silhouette against it. Despite the night's disturbance, she felt oddly secure knowing he was keeping vigil. Sleep came more quickly than she expected, deep and dreamless. When Josephine next opened her eyes, pale dawn light was filtering through the tent canvas. She emerged to find Blake already awake, tending a fresh fire over which a pot of coffee simmered. His eyes, though showing signs of a sleepless night, remained alert and watchful. You didn't wake me, she accused mildly. Blake offered an unapologetic smile. You needed the rest more than I did. He poured a cup of coffee and extended it toward her. Besides, the night passed without further incident. Josephine accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her fingers around its warmth. Thank you for everything. No thanks needed, Blake replied, turning to prepare his own coffee. Now, we should discuss our plan for the day. That wagon isn't going anywhere with its broken axle. Josephine nodded, the problem of her transportation returning to the forefront of her mind. "What do you suggest?" "We'll need to transfer your essentials to my horse. He's strong enough to carry you and your most important belongings. The rest—" He hesitated. "I'm afraid we'll have to leave it secured in the wagon for now. I can send someone back from Clifton to retrieve it once we arrive." The thought of abandoning her possessions, meager though they were, caused Josephine a pang of distress. Everything she owned was in that wagon: books, clothes, the few mementos she had of her parents. Yet she recognized the practicality of Blake's suggestion. "How far is Clifton from here?" she asked. "About 20 miles, Blake answered. "We can make it by late afternoon if we set out soon." "Very well," Josephine agreed. "Let me gather what I can't bear to leave behind." They worked efficiently, packing her teaching materials, essential clothing, and a few precious keepsakes into saddlebags that Blake attached to his horse. The animal, a magnificent chestnut stallion named Rusty, bore the additional burden without complaint, occasionally nudging Blake's shoulder as if to reassure him of his capabilities. "He seems quite attached to you," Josephine observed as she watched the interaction between man and horse. Blake patted Rusty's neck affectionately, raised him from a colt. "We've been through a lot together." He secured the last of the saddlebags and turned to Josephine. "Are you ready?" Josephine cast a final glance at her wagon, trying to suppress the worry that her remaining possessions might not be there when someone returned for them. "As ready as circumstances allow," she replied. Mounting proved to be its own challenge. Despite Blake's assistance, Josephine found herself acutely aware of his hands at her waist as he helped her settle behind the saddle. The impropriety of their arrangement wasn't lost on her, a young woman riding with a man she'd met just hours before, her skirts hiked unseemingly high to accommodate the horse. Yet necessity, once again, overruled conventional propriety. "You'll need to hold on to me," Blake instructed as he swung up into the saddle in front of her. "It's a long ride, and the terrain isn't always smooth." Josephine hesitantly placed her hands on his sides, maintaining as much distance between them as the confines of the horse would allow. As they set off, however, the first jolt of the horse's movement sent her lurching forward, her body pressing momentarily against Blake's back before she could right herself. "You might want a firmer grip than that," Blake suggested, a hint of amusement coloring his voice. "I promise not to misconstrue it as anything other than practical necessity." Feeling her cheeks warm with embarrassment, Josephine adjusted her hold, her arms now circling his waist more securely. The solid strength of him beneath her hands was both reassuring and disturbingly intimate. They traveled at a steady pace, the morning sun climbing higher in the sky as they followed the road toward Clifton. Despite her discomfort with their physical proximity, Josephine found herself relaxing as the hours passed. Blake proved to be an engaging traveling companion, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the region's history and natural features. "See that formation to the east?" he asked during a brief rest to water the horse. The Apache believed it was the sleeping form of a great warrior, turned to stone by the gods to forever watch over these lands. Josephine shaded her eyes, examining the distant rock formation that did indeed resemble a reclining figure. "It's beautiful country," she admitted. "Very different from what I was accustomed to back east." "You're from the east originally?" Blake asked, offering her a canteen. "Pennsylvania," she replied, taking a grateful sip. "My father moved us to Tucson after my mother died. He had a cousin there who offered him work." She handed back the canteen. "What about your family? Have the Xanders always been in Arizona?" "3 generations now," Blake confirmed. "My grandfather came west during the gold rush, but found ranching more to his liking than prospecting. He established the Double X before Arizona was even a proper territory. As they resumed their journey, Josephine found herself increasingly curious about this man who had so unexpectedly entered her life. His manner was that of a gentleman, despite the rough exterior and frontier upbringing. He spoke with an education that seemed at odds with the typical cowboy, and his consideration for her comfort was constant throughout their journey. By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly, and Blake suggested they stop in the shade of a small copse of cottonwoods near a shallow creek. He helped Josephine dismount, his hands lingering at her waist perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary before he stepped back. "We'll rest here for an hour," he said, leading Rusty to the water. "Let the horse drink and cool down a bit." Josephine was grateful for the respite. Hours in the saddle had left her muscles aching in unfamiliar ways, and the heat of the day had become oppressive. She settled beneath one of the trees, arranging her skirts modestly around her as she watched Blake tend to his horse with practiced efficiency. "You care deeply for him," she observed. Blake glanced up, a smile warming his features. "Rusty's earned it. A good horse is more valuable than gold out here, especially one that doesn't spook at gunfire or balk at carrying double through rough country." He joined her in the shade after ensuring Rusty was comfortable, maintaining a respectful distance as he sat against a neighboring tree. From his saddlebag, he produced bread, dried meat, and apples, a simple but welcome meal that they shared in companionable silence. "May I ask you something, Miss Nelson?" Blake said after they had eaten. "Of course. What made you choose teaching as your profession? It's not an easy life, especially out here." Josephine considered the question, appreciating that he had asked about her vocation rather than why she remained unmarried, as most men would have. "I love watching children discover their own capabilities," she answered honestly. "There's a moment when a child who's been struggling with reading suddenly understands, their whole face lights up with the realization that those marks on paper have meaning. That moment is worth every difficulty." Blake nodded, genuine interest in his expression. "My mother was briefly a teacher before she married my father. She always said it was the most rewarding work she'd ever done." "She must have been a remarkable woman," Josephine said softly. "She was." A shadow of grief passed over his face before he continued. "She made sure we all received education, even when the nearest school was 20 miles away. Taught us herself when she couldn't send us to town." "Is that where your appreciation for learning comes from? I noticed you're more well-spoken than many men in similar occupations." Blake chuckled. "Mother would accept nothing less than proper grammar at her dinner table, ranch life notwithstanding. Said just because we worked with cattle didn't mean we had to sound like them." The comment surprised a laugh from Josephine, bright and genuine. Blake looked momentarily startled by the sound, then smiled in response, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners. "You have a beautiful laugh, Miss Nelson," he said, the compliment offered simply, without pretense. Josephine felt warmth rise to her cheeks. "Thank you, Mr. Xanders. And please, after all we've been through, I think you might call me Josephine." "Josephine," he repeated, as if testing the feel of her name. "Then I insist you call me Blake." The exchange, small as it was, shifted something between them, an acknowledgement of the unusual bond that had formed through their shared ordeal. As they prepared to continue their journey, Josephine found herself less self-conscious about holding on to Blake as they rode, and he seemed more at ease in conversation, sharing stories of his ranch and family with increasing openness. The landscape gradually changed as they traveled, the flat desert giving way to more varied terrain with rocky outcroppings and deeper arroyos. Blake pointed out a distant plume of smoke rising into the clear blue sky. "That's Clifton," he said. "The smelters for the copper mines." "We're getting close." Josephine felt a mixture of relief and a strange reluctance. Their arrival in Clifton would mark the end of this unexpected journey together, and she was surprised to find herself somewhat regretful of that fact. Blake Xanders had proven himself to be not just a protector, but a man of character and intelligence qualities she had found rare in her experiences since her father's death. As they crested a final hill in the late afternoon, the town of Clifton came into view in the valley below. It was larger than Josephine had expected, with a main street lined with substantial buildings and smaller structures spreading outward. The copper smelters dominated one end of town, belching smoke into the air, while the surrounding hills showed the scars of mining operations. "It's not the prettiest town," Blake admitted, following her gaze, "but it's growing and there are good people here." "It looks quite established," Josephine observed. "I had imagined something smaller. The copper mines have brought prosperity and people. The town's grown considerably in the last few years." He pointed to a white building set slightly apart from the main cluster. "That's your schoolhouse there. New construction, finished just last month." Josephine felt a flutter of anticipation at the sight of the building where she would soon begin her new life. "It looks lovely." "The town's proud of it," Blake said. "They've been waiting eagerly for a proper teacher to arrive." As they approached the outskirts of town, people began to notice their arrival. Several called out greetings to Blake, their curious gazes lingering on Josephine. She was acutely aware of the picture they presented, her traveling dress dusty from the journey, her hair coming loose from its pins, seated intimately behind Blake on his horse. The town would be buzzing with speculation before nightfall. Blake seemed to sense her discomfort. "Don't worry about the talk," he said quietly. "Once they hear how your wagon broke down and I offered assistance, they'll understand. Folks here know the dangers of the territory." "I hope you're right," Josephine replied. "I would hate to begin my position under a cloud of scandal." "The school board is run by sensible people," Blake assured her. "They'll be too relieved at your safe arrival to concern themselves with appearances." They rode directly to the sheriff's office, where Blake explained the situation with her wagon and the incident with the would-be robber. Sheriff Thornton, a graying man with shrewd eyes, took the information seriously, promising to send deputies to retrieve Josephine's belongings the next day. "Fortunate you came along when you did, Blake," the sheriff commented. "Miss Nelson could have faced real trouble out there alone." "Providence, perhaps," Blake replied, with a brief glance at Josephine that made her heart quicken unexpectedly. From the sheriff's office, Blake escorted her to the boarding house where arrangements had been made for her accommodation. Mrs. Wilkins, the proprietress, was a plump, motherly woman who clucked sympathetically over Josephine's ordeal and assured her that a hot bath would be prepared immediately. "You must be exhausted, you poor dear," she fussed, leading Josephine inside while Blake remained with the horse outside. "To think of being stranded in the wilderness. Thank goodness Blake found you. He's one of our most respected young men, you know." "He was a perfect gentleman," Josephine assured her, aware of how important such assurances would be for her reputation. Mrs. Wilkins nodded approvingly. "Never doubted it for a moment. The Xanders boys were raised right." She showed Josephine to a small but clean room on the second floor. "This will be yours for as long as you need it. Most of our teachers stay here until they find more permanent arrangements." After thanking the woman, Josephine returned downstairs to where Blake waited. He stood beside his horse, hat in hand, looking somehow both at home and out of place on the civilized street. "I suppose this is where we part ways," Josephine said, surprising herself with the hint of regret in her voice. "For now," Blake agreed. "I should get back to the ranch. My father and brother will be wondering what delayed me." He hesitated, then added, "But I'd like to call on you if you permit it. Perhaps show you around Clifton once you've had time to settle." The offer sent an unexpected thrill through Josephine. "I would like that very much," she replied. Blake's smile brightened his entire face. "Then I'll return in a few days." He placed his hat back on his head and mounted Rusty with practiced ease. "Welcome to Clifton, Miss Josephine Nelson." As she watched him ride away, Josephine felt a curious certainty that her new life in Clifton would be shaped by Blake Xanders in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Her broken wagon, which had seemed such a disaster at sunset the previous day, now appeared more like the beginning of something remarkable. The following days passed in a whirlwind of activity as Josephine settled into her new role in Clifton. The school board members, 5 of the town's most prominent citizens, formally welcomed her with a small reception at the newly constructed schoolhouse. They were indeed more concerned with her qualifications and teaching philosophy than with the circumstances of her arrival, much to her relief. The schoolhouse itself exceeded her expectations. Though simple in design, it boasted large windows that flooded the single classroom with natural light, solid wooden desks for 20 students, and a small attached room that served as both office and library. A blackboard dominated the front wall, and a pot-bellied stove promised warmth during the winter months. "We have 18 children enrolled so far," explained Mr. Hargrove, the head of the school board. "Ages 6 to 14. Some have had structured schooling before, others hardly any at all." "A challenge I look forward to," Josephine assured him, already envisioning how she would arrange the classroom to accommodate different learning levels. By the time Sheriff Thornton's deputies returned with her salvaged possessions from the wagon 3 days after her arrival, Josephine had established herself in her boarding house room and prepared lesson plans for her first week of teaching. Some items had been lost or damaged, but most of her books and personal belongings arrived intact, allowing her to truly begin settling into her new home. What she hadn't expected was how frequently her thoughts turned to Blake Xanders during these busy days. Each time the boarding house door opened, she found herself glancing up, half hoping to see his tall figure. When Mrs. Wilkins mentioned the Double X Ranch during dinner conversation, Josephine listened with particular attention, gathering fragments of information about Blake's family and their standing in the community. True to his word, Blake called at the boarding house 5 days after their arrival in Clifton. Josephine had just returned from an afternoon at the schoolhouse when Mrs. Wilkins knocked at her door. "You have a visitor in the parlor, dear," she announced with a knowing smile that suggested she'd noticed Josephine's interest. "Mr. Xanders is asking if you might be available for a tour of the town." Josephine felt a flutter of anticipation as she checked her appearance in the small mirror above her washstand. Her navy blue dress was simple but becoming, and she had pinned her honey-brown hair in a neat style that she hoped struck a balance between schoolteacher propriety and personal charm. Blake stood as she entered the parlor, and the genuine pleasure that lit his face at the sight of her sent warmth spreading through her chest. "Miss Nelson," he greeted her, hat in hand. "You're looking well. Clifton seems to agree with you." "Mr. Xanders," she returned with a smile. "I'm glad you kept your promise to call. And yes, I'm finding my place here quite satisfactorily." Mrs. Wilkins bustled about, ostensibly straightening objects in the parlor but clearly intent on chaperoning. Blake acknowledged the situation with a slight quirk of his lips before addressing Josephine formally. "I thought you might appreciate a proper introduction to our town, now that you've had some time to settle in." There's more to Clifton than meets the eye. I would enjoy that very much, Josephine replied. With Mrs. Wilkins' approving nod, they set out into the late afternoon sunshine. Blake offered his arm, which Josephine accepted with only a moment's hesitation. The contact, even through layers of clothing, was pleasantly distracting. "I hear you've already made quite an impression on the school board," Blake commented as they walked down the main street. Josephine glanced at him in surprise. "News travels quickly here." "Small towns," Blake shrugged with a smile. "Mr. Hargrove mentioned to my father that they are fortunate to have secured such a qualified teacher. Apparently, your ideas for the curriculum were very well received." "That's gratifying to hear," Josephine admitted. "I was concerned my methods might be considered too progressive for a frontier town." "Clifton may be on the frontier, but its citizens have ambitions for their children," Blake said. "Many came west seeking opportunity, not escape from civilization." As they walked, Blake pointed out buildings of interest: the mercantile, the assayer's office, the bank, and the town's two competing hotels. People greeted them as they passed, some with open curiosity, others with knowing smiles that made Josephine conscious of the public nature of their stroll. "Everyone seems to know you," she observed. Blake chuckled. "When your grandfather helped found a town, and your family supplies most of its beef, anonymity isn't really an option." They paused at the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to a view of the surrounding landscape. The setting sun bathed the distant mountains in golden light, the beauty of the scene momentarily stealing Josephine's breath. "I can see why people choose to stay here despite the hardships," she said softly. Blake studied her profile. "The territory demands much, but it gives much in return. Freedom, opportunity, beauty." His voice held a note that drew her eyes to his, and for a moment, Josephine wondered if he was still speaking of the landscape. He cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "I should show you the church before we lose the light. It's where you'll be expected on Sundays, and where your students have been taking lessons until now." The church was a simple white painted structure with a modest steeple. Inside, the afternoon light filtered through plain glass windows, illuminating rows of hand-crafted pews and a small pulpit. "It's lovely," Josephine said, her voice naturally hushed in the quiet space. "Reverend Phillips will be glad to hear you think so," Blake replied. "He's been serving as teacher in addition to his pastoral duties. I think he'll be more relieved than anyone to have you take over the education portion of his responsibilities." As they exited the church, Blake hesitated, seeming to wrestle with something on his mind. Would you care to join my family for dinner this Sunday after services? My father has expressed an interest in meeting you, and I thought it might be a good opportunity for you to make connections beyond the town itself." The invitation, formal as it was, caused Josephine's heart to beat a little faster. An introduction to his family suggested that Blake's interest in her might extend beyond neighborly courtesy. "I would be honored," she replied, careful to keep her tone measured despite the pleasure the invitation gave her. "Thank you for thinking of me." Blake's smile was warm enough to chase away the evening chill that had begun to settle around them. "Excellent. I'll arrange to bring you out to the ranch after church." They walked back toward the boarding house in comfortable conversation, discussing the upcoming school term and Josephine's plans for her students. At the boarding house steps, Blake paused, reluctance evident in his manner. "Thank you for the tour," Josephine said, equally reluctant to end their time together. "It's helpful to have a better sense of the town's layout." "The pleasure was mine," Blake replied. He hesitated, then added, "Perhaps, if your duties permit, we might continue your introduction to Clifton another day. There are some beautiful spots just outside town that are worth seeing." "I'd like that," Josephine answered honestly. Blake's eyes held hers a moment longer than strictly proper, and Josephine felt the same connection that had formed during their journey to Clifton, a recognition of something kindred in each other. "Until Sunday, then," he said finally, stepping back and placing his hat on his head with a slight tip toward her. "Until Sunday," she echoed, watching as he walked away down the darkening street. Inside, Mrs. Wilkins was waiting with barely concealed curiosity. "Did you have a pleasant walk, dear?" she asked innocently. "Very pleasant," Josephine replied, unable to suppress a smile. "Mr. Xanders was kind enough to invite me to dinner with his family this Sunday after church." Mrs. Wilkins' eyebrows rose. "Is that so? Well now, that's quite significant. The Xanders don't extend such invitations lightly." She patted Josephine's hand. "Blake's a fine young man. His mother would be proud of the man he's become." "You knew his mother?" Josephine asked, curious about the woman who had shaped Blake's character. "Eleanor Xanders was one of my dearest friends," Mrs. Wilkins confirmed, a hint of sadness crossing her round face. "A remarkable woman, educated, refined, but strong as they come. Had to be to build a life out here with Thomas Xanders." She smiled at a distant memory. "Blake has her eyes and her love of books. Got his father's determination, though." Josephine absorbed this information, adding it to her growing understanding of the man who had rescued her on that lonely road. Sunday arrived with clear skies and mild weather. Josephine dressed with particular care in her best dress, a deep green that complemented her hazel eyes, and arrived at church early to make proper introductions to Reverend Phillips. The congregation welcomed her warmly, many parents bringing children forward to meet their new teacher. Blake arrived with his father and brother just before the service began. He spotted Josephine immediately, a smile lighting his face as he guided the older men toward her. "Miss Nelson," he greeted her formally, "may I present my father, Thomas Xanders, and my brother, Daniel." Thomas Xanders was a tall, broad-shouldered man with silver-streaked dark hair and a weathered face that spoke of decades under the Arizona sun. His handshake was firm, his assessment direct but not unkind. "So you're the young lady Blake rescued," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "We're grateful he came along when he did. These roads can be dangerous for a traveler alone." "I'm the one who's grateful, Mr. Xanders," Josephine replied. "Your son's assistance was both timely and chivalrous." Daniel Xanders, younger than Blake by perhaps 4 or 5 years, offered a more exuberant greeting. "Blake's told us all about your adventure," he said with a grin that revealed the family resemblance. "Said you were ready to shoot him when he first approached." Josephine felt heat rise to her cheeks. Caution seemed advisable under the circumstances. "Wise caution," Thomas nodded approvingly. "A woman needs her wits about her in this territory." The church bell interrupted further conversation, and the Xanders men escorted Josephine to a pew near the front. Throughout the service, she was acutely aware of Blake beside her, his shoulder occasionally brushing hers when he shifted position. After the service, they traveled to the Double X Ranch in the Xanders wagon. The property was located about 5 miles outside town, a sprawling operation with a large main house, several outbuildings, and expansive grazing lands stretching toward distant hills. Blake's grandfather built the original cabin, Thomas explained as they approached. "My Eleanor and I added to it over the years as the family and the herd grew." The house was impressive by frontier standards, a 2-story structure built of sturdy timber with a wide porch wrapping around the front and one side. A woman emerged from the front door as they arrived, wiping her hands on her apron. "That's Martha," Blake said to Josephine. "Our housekeeper since Mother passed. She's practically family." Martha welcomed Josephine warmly, ushering everyone inside to a dining room where the table was set with what was clearly the family's best china. The meal she served was bountiful roast beef, potatoes, fresh vegetables, and homemade bread, far surpassing the simple fare at Mrs. Wilkins' boarding house. Throughout dinner, Josephine found herself the center of attention as the Xanders men inquired about her background, education, and teaching experience. Thomas, in particular, asked thoughtful questions that revealed his own surprising breadth of knowledge. Alina insisted on maintaining a library, he explained when Josephine commented on his familiarity with current educational theories. Said just because we lived 50 miles from the nearest city didn't mean our minds should wither. Mother would have enjoyed your company, Blake added, his gaze warm as it rested on Josephine. She always lamented the shortage of educated women in the territory. After the meal, Blake offered to show Josephine the ranch while Thomas retired to his study, and Daniel went to check on a new foal in the stables. They walked across the yard toward a small rise that offered a view of the entire property, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the landscape. Your family has built something remarkable here, Josephine said, taking in the extent of the ranch. It's taken 3 generations, Blake acknowledged, and it hasn't always been easy. Drought, cattle thieves, conflicts with the Apache before the peace, each generation has faced its challenges. Yet you've persevered, Blake nodded. We Xanders are stubborn that way. He glanced at her with a hint of humor. Not unlike a certain schoolteacher who traveled alone across dangerous territory to reach her new position. Josephine laughed softly. Perhaps we have that in common, then. They reached the top of the rise, where a single oak tree provided shade. From this vantage point, the double X spread out before them, cattle grazing in distant pastures, cowboys moving among them on horseback, smoke rising from the bunkhouse chimney. It's beautiful, Josephine said honestly. Yes, it is, Blake replied, though when she turned, she found him looking at her rather than the landscape. The intensity in his blue eyes made her breath catch. They stood close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the slight stubble on his jaw that he'd missed when shaving. Josephine, he said, her name soft on his lips. I find myself thinking about you far more than is probably proper for such a short acquaintance. The directness of his statement surprised her, though not unpleasantly. I've been thinking about you as well, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Blake took a half step closer. I know it's too soon to speak of certain things. You've only just arrived in Clifton. You're establishing yourself in your position, and we've known each other mere days. He paused, searching her face. But I want you to know that I intend to call on you properly if you're amenable. I am, Josephine answered, the words coming easily despite the propriety that should have demanded more hesitation. The smile that spread across Blake's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Good, he said simply. Very good. They stood in that moment, possibility hanging between them like the golden dust motes in the late afternoon light. Then, with visible effort, Blake stepped back. We should return to the house, he said reluctantly. Father will be wondering where we've disappeared to, and I need to get you back to town before dark. As they walked back, Blake offered his arm once more, and Josephine took it, feeling a growing certainty that her life had changed irrevocably the moment her wagon wheel had broken on that lonely road. The weeks that followed established a pattern that quickly became the foundation of Josephine's life in Clifton. Her days were filled with teaching challenging but deeply rewarding work with children eager for knowledge. The evenings often found her preparing lessons, grading assignments, or occasionally joining Mrs. Wilkins and the other boarders for quiet conversation in the parlor. but it was the moments with Blake that she treasured most. True to his word, he called on her regularly, sometimes for walks around town, sometimes for longer excursions to scenic spots in the surrounding countryside. Always respectful of her reputation, he ensured their outings were either properly chaperoned or conducted in full public view. As September gave way to October and the desert heat began to moderate, their connection deepened through shared confidences and discovered commonalities. Blake revealed his love of literature, a passion inherited from his mother that surprised many who knew him only as a rancher. Josephine shared her dreams of one day establishing a proper library for Clifton, making books available to all who wished to learn. On a particularly pleasant Saturday in mid-October, Blake arrived at the boarding house with a picnic basket and a proposal for an afternoon outing. "There's a place I'd like to show you," he said. "About an hour's ride from town. Mrs. Wilkins has agreed to accompany us as chaperone if you're interested." Josephine, who had been grading arithmetic papers all morning, welcomed the diversion. "That sounds wonderful. Give me a moment to change into something more suitable for riding." Blake had brought horses for both Josephine and Mrs. Wilkins, who settled herself on a gentle mare with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent decades in the territory. They rode at a leisurely pace, following a trail that led away from town into increasingly rugged terrain. "Where exactly are we going?" Josephine asked as they navigated a narrow pass between towering rock formations. "Patience," Blake replied with a mysterious smile. "It's a place few in Clifton know about. My father showed it to my mother during their courtship." Mrs. Wilkins, riding several paces behind them, called forward. Eleanor spoke of it once, said it was where Thomas proposed. Blake nodded. "That's right. He brought her here on her birthday, 9 months after they first met." The significance of Blake sharing such a place with her wasn't lost on Josephine. Their growing relationship, while still undefined, had taken on a weight and direction that both excited and mildly alarmed her. Her position as Clifton's schoolteacher demanded a certain propriety, yet her heart increasingly yearned for Blake's company. They emerged from the pass into a hidden valley that drew a gasp of wonder from Josephine. A small, spring-fed lake glittered in the sunlight, surrounded by cottonwoods whose leaves had turned golden with the season. The rugged cliffs that enclosed the valley created a natural sanctuary from the harsh desert beyond. "Blake, it's magical," Josephine breathed, dismounting with his assistants. "I thought you might appreciate it," he replied, his hands lingering at her waist a moment before propriety dictated he step back. "It's especially beautiful in autumn." Mrs. Wilkins dismounted with Daniel's help, surveying the spot with fond recognition. "Eleanor called it her private Eden," she commented. "Said she'd never seen Thomas so nervous as when he brought her here to propose." They spread a blanket beneath one of the larger cottonwoods, and Blake unpacked the picnic basket. Martha had prepared cold chicken, fresh bread, preserves, and a bottle of apple cider. The meal was enjoyed in companionable conversation, with Mrs. Wilkins regaling them with stories of Clifton's early days. After they had eaten, Mrs. Wilkins announced her intention to rest her eyes for a few minutes against the tree trunk, a transparent excuse to give them a measure of privacy while maintaining the appearance of chaperonage. Blake seized the opportunity, inviting Josephine to walk along the shore of the small lake. "Your students seem to be progressing well," he commented as they strolled. "Father mentioned that the Hargrove boy has finally taken to his reading." "Timothy needed a different approach than the other children," Josephine explained. "Once I discovered his love of adventure stories, it was simply a matter of finding material that captured his interest." Blake nodded appreciatively. That's the mark of a good teacher, seeing the individual behind the student. They walked in silence for a moment before Blake spoke again, his tone more serious. Josephine, there's something I've been wanting to discuss with you. The gravity in his voice caused her heart to quicken. Yes. Blake stopped walking, turning to face her directly. In the 6 weeks since we met, I've come to care for you deeply, more deeply than I thought possible in such a short time. He took a breath. I know this may seem hasty, but life in the territory has taught me not to delay when something important presents itself. Josephine stood very still, hardly daring to breathe as Blake continued. I'm not proposing marriage today. That would be presumptuous given how brief our acquaintance has been, but I want to declare my intentions clearly. His blue eyes held hers steadily. I'm courting you with the hope that, in time, you might consider becoming my wife. Though she had begun to suspect the direction of his feelings, hearing them stated so plainly sent a rush of emotion through Josephine. Her own heart had been moving toward him with increasing certainty, yet caution born of past disappointments made her hesitate. Blake, she began carefully, I care for you too very much, but my position here is still new and I've learned to be wary of making life-changing decisions hastily. Rather than disappointment, understanding filled his expression. I'm not asking for an answer today, he assured her. Only permission to continue calling on you with serious intentions, rather than under the guise of merely showing a newcomer around Clifton. Relief and joy mingled in Josephine's response. You have my permission, and my heart is certainly inclined in your direction. The smile that transformed Blake's face was worth any lingering uncertainty. Mindful of Mrs. Wilkins' presence, however distant, he restrained himself to taking Josephine's gloved hand and pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. That's all I can ask for now, he said softly. The ride back to town was filled with a new awareness between them, a shared secret that manifested in exchanged glances and brush of hands as Blake helped Josephine dismount at the boarding house. Mrs. Wilkins observed it all with knowing approval, having witnessed the beginning of many courtships during her years in Clifton. That boy's father courted his mother for exactly 4 months before proposing. She informed Josephine that evening as they sat in the parlor. Eleanor told me she knew she would accept from their 3rd meeting, but made him wait the full 4 months to be certain. Josephine smiled at the story. Did she ever regret marrying so quickly? Not once in all the years I knew her, Mrs. Wilkins replied confidently. Said the only regret would have been wasting time they could have spent building their life together. The older woman's words stayed with Josephine as she prepared for bed that night. She had come to Clifton seeking a fresh start, focused entirely on establishing herself as a teacher. Romance had been far from her mind. Yet now, as she considered a future that might include Blake Xanders, she found the prospect both terrifying and exhilarating. The following weeks brought a deepening of their relationship as Blake courted her with unwavering attention. He attended the school's harvest pageant in early November, his pride evident as he watched Josephine guide her students through their performances. She, in turn, visited the ranch on Sundays, gradually becoming more involved in the Xanders family life. Thomas Xanders observed their growing attachment with gruff approval, while Daniel teased his brother good-naturedly about his devotion to the schoolmarm. Even Martha, typically reserved in her opinions, made a point of showing Josephine around the kitchen during one visit, explaining family recipes with the air of passing on important knowledge. As Thanksgiving approached, Blake invited Josephine to join the Xanders family for the holiday dinner. It would mean a great deal to have you there, he said as they walked together after church one Sunday. Father has specifically requested your company. I would be honored, Josephine replied, touched by the inclusion in their family celebration. Thanksgiving at the Double X proved to be a festive affair, with the table extended to accommodate not only the family, but also several hands who had no relations nearby. Martha outdid herself with the meal, producing a feast that reminded Josephine of holidays with her own family years earlier. After dinner, as the men gathered on the porch to smoke and the ranch hands drifted toward the bunkhouse, Blake suggested a walk to digest the enormous meal. The November air was crisp, but not uncomfortable as they strolled toward the oak tree on the rise where Blake had first declared his intentions. "I have something for you," he said when they reached the spot, reaching into his pocket. "An early Christmas gift, you might say." From his pocket, he produced a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Josephine opened it carefully to reveal a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. "Blake, it's beautiful," she said, running her finger over the intricate engraving on its surface. "Open it," he encouraged. Inside was a small portrait not of Blake, as she had half expected, but of a landscape. Upon closer inspection, Josephine recognized the hidden valley with its lake and cottonwoods where he had declared his intentions. "I commissioned it from an artist passing through town," Blake explained. "So you would always have a reminder of that day." Touched beyond words, Josephine looked up at him with shining eyes. "Would you help me put it on?" Blake carefully fastened the chain around her neck, his fingers brushing the sensitive skin at her nape in a way that sent a pleasant shiver down her spine. When he stepped back, the locket rested just below her collar, a tangible symbol of what was growing between them. "Perfect," he murmured. They stood close, the intensity of the moment drawing them together until Josephine could feel the warmth of his breath on her face. With careful restraint, Blake leaned forward and pressed a gentle, chaste kiss to her forehead, the first such intimate contact between them. "Thank you for being part of our Thanksgiving," he said softly. "I have much to be grateful for this year." "As do I," Josephine replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "More than I ever expected when my wagon broke down on that lonely road." December brought a rare dusting of snow to Clifton, transforming the rugged landscape into something magical for the few days it lasted. The children were beside themselves with excitement, and Josephine incorporated the unusual weather into her lessons, having them write poems about snow and calculate the rate of melting in different areas of the schoolyard. The approach of Christmas filled the town with festive preparations. The schoolhouse hosted a Christmas pageant, with every child participating in some capacity. Blake attended proudly, sitting beside his father and brother in the front row. Afterward, as the families mingled and enjoyed refreshments, Thomas Xanders approached Josephine with uncharacteristic formality. "Miss Nelson," he began, "I wonder if I might have a word with you in private." Curious and slightly apprehensive, Josephine followed him to a quiet corner of the schoolroom. Thomas cleared his throat, seeming uncharacteristically hesitant. "I'll come straight to the point," he said finally. "My son is deeply in love with you." Though not surprised by this declaration, Josephine felt heat rise to her cheeks at having it stated so directly by Blake's father. "I believe his feelings are sincere, Mr. Xanders." "They are," Thomas nodded firmly. "Blake doesn't give his heart easily." His mother was the same way, cautious until certain, then unwavering. He paused, studying Josephine's face. "He hasn't asked you to marry him yet, has he?" "No," Josephine confirmed, wondering at the purpose of this conversation. Thomas nodded again. "He's showing restraint, which is proper. But I know my son, and I expect he'll be proposing before too long." His expression softened slightly. "I wanted you to know that you have my blessing, should you choose to accept him. You're a fine woman, Josephine Nelson, the kind of partner a man needs in this territory." Deeply moved by this gruff endorsement, Josephine found herself blinking back unexpected tears. "Thank you, Mr. Xanders. Your approval means a great deal to me." Thomas reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, worn leather pouch. "There's one more thing." This was Alina's. He opened the pouch to reveal a gold ring set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "It was her mother's before her, brought west when she married my father-in-law. Blake doesn't know I've kept it for this purpose." Josephine stared at the ring, understanding the significance of what Thomas was entrusting to her. "Mr. Xanders, you don't need to say anything now," Thomas interrupted gently. "Just know that when the time comes, this is waiting. Alina would have wanted you to have it." He closed the pouch and pressed it into her hand, closing her fingers around it with a paternal squeeze. "Welcome to our family, Josephine, whenever you're ready to make it official." The conversation left Josephine in a state of emotional turmoil. The ring pouch, now hidden in her dresser drawer back at the boarding house, represented a future she had begun to envision with increasing clarity. Yet questions lingered in her mind about the speed of their courtship, about maintaining her independence and position as a teacher if she were to become Blake's wife. These thoughts occupied her as Christmas approached. Blake had invited her to spend Christmas Day at the ranch, and Josephine had accepted, planning to attend church in town before joining the Xanders family for dinner and gift exchanges. Christmas Eve brought a clear, cold night with stars blazing overhead like diamonds scattered across black velvet. After the children's pageant at church, Blake escorted Josephine back to the boarding house, both of them bundled against the December chill. "Will you walk with me a little longer?" Blake asked as they reached the boarding house. "The night is too beautiful to end it so soon." Despite the cold, Josephine agreed readily. They strolled toward the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open country. The moonlight transformed the landscape, softening its harsh contours into something almost ethereal. "I've been thinking about the day we met," Blake said as they paused to admire the view. "How different my life would be if I'd taken another route back to Clifton that day." "Providence," Josephine murmured, echoing his words from months earlier. "I believe it was," Blake agreed. He turned to face her, taking both her gloved hands in his. "Josephine, these past 3 months have been the happiest of my life. Getting to know you, watching you with your students, seeing you find your place in Clifton, it's all confirmed what I began to suspect that very first night by the campfire." Josephine's heart began to race, recognizing the shift in his tone and the intent in his eyes. "I had planned to wait longer," Blake continued, "to give you more time to be certain. But my father said something to me recently that made sense, that when you know your heart with certainty, waiting is just wasting precious time." With deliberate movements, Blake lowered himself to one knee in the moonlight, still holding her hands in his. "Josephine Nelson, you entered my life unexpectedly, but have become essential to my happiness. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Though she had begun to anticipate this moment, the reality of it, Blake kneeling before her under the vast starry sky, his eyes filled with love and hope, momentarily robbed Josephine of speech. In that silence, the questions and uncertainties that had troubled her seemed to fall away, leaving only the certainty of her feelings for this man. "Yes," she whispered, then more firmly, "Yes, Blake, I will marry you." Joy transformed his features as he rose to his feet. With reverent care, he removed his glove and then hers, slipping a ring onto her finger, a simple gold band with a small but perfect diamond that caught the moonlight. "It was my grandmother's," he explained. "I've been carrying it with me for weeks, waiting for the right moment." Josephine looked down at the ring, then back at Blake's face. "It's beautiful." She thought briefly of the pearl ring Thomas had entrusted to her, deciding that would be a conversation for another day. Blake's hands gently framed her face. "May I kiss you, Josephine? Properly this time." Her answer was to rise slightly on her toes, bringing her face closer to his in silent permission. Blake's lips met hers with tender restraint that quickly deepened into something more meaningful. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as Josephine's hands rested on his chest, feeling the strong beat of his heart beneath her palms. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Blake rested his forehead against hers. "Merry Christmas, my love." "Merry Christmas," she replied, her voice soft with emotion. They walked back to the boarding house hand in hand, the new weight of the ring on Josephine's finger a constant reminder of the commitment they had just made. At the door, Blake kissed her once more, a gentle promise of their future together. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said. "We have an announcement to make." "Your father may not be surprised," Josephine replied with a small smile, thinking of her conversation with Thomas. Blake chuckled. "No, I expect not. He's been none too subtle with his hints these past few weeks." Inside, Mrs. Wilkins was waiting up, ostensibly reading by the parlor fire but clearly anticipating Josephine's return. Her eyes immediately went to Josephine's left hand, widening at the sight of the ring. "Well now," she said, satisfaction evident in her tone. "I believe congratulations are in order." Josephine couldn't suppress her smile. "He proposed tonight." Mrs. Wilkins enveloped her in a warm hug. "Couldn't have happened to two more deserving people. Eleanor would be so pleased." The Christmas Day announcement at the Double X was met with enthusiastic approval. Daniel clapped his brother on the back with good-natured teasing about finally making an honest declaration, while Thomas embraced Josephine with uncharacteristic emotion, whispering, "Welcome to the family, daughter." Later, in a private moment, Josephine showed Blake the ring his father had given her, explaining Thomas's visit after the school pageant. Blake was visibly moved by his father's gesture. "Mother would have loved you," he said, examining the pearl ring. This was her most treasured possession. "Your father thought we might use it as a wedding band," Josephine suggested. Blake nodded, his eyes suspiciously bright. "I'd like that very much." They decided on a spring wedding, giving Josephine time to complete the school year and make arrangements for the transition to married life. Blake began work on expanding the family home, adding rooms that would provide them with private quarters while remaining connected to the main house. The winter months passed in a flurry of teaching, planning, and increasingly precious moments together. Josephine found herself welcomed fully into the rhythms of the Xanders family, included in decisions and traditions as if she were already Blake's wife. In turn, she brought her own sensibilities to the ranch, suggesting improvements to the house and gardens that would make it more of a home. By the time April arrived with an explosion of desert wildflowers, the preparations for their wedding were nearly complete. The ceremony would take place at the church in Clifton, with a reception afterward at the ranch. Josephine's students had insisted on participating, planning a special song to perform for their beloved teacher and her groom. The night before the wedding, Blake rode into town for the traditional separation before the ceremony. They stood on the boarding house porch, reluctant to part despite the custom. "This time tomorrow, you'll be Mrs. Xanders," Blake said, his fingers intertwined with hers. "It hardly seems possible," Josephine replied. "Sometimes I still think about how close I came to missing you entirely. If my wagon hadn't broken when it did on that particular stretch of road, then I would have found you some other way," Blake insisted. "I believe that now. We were meant to find each other." The conviction in his voice warmed her. "I believe it too." Their wedding day dawned clear and perfect, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of spring blossoms. The church was filled to capacity not just with Clifton's residents, but with ranchers and miners from miles around, all come to witness the union of the schoolteacher and the rancher's son. Josephine wore a gown of ivory satin that Mrs. Wilkins had helped her sew, with lace from her mother's wedding dress incorporated into the collar and cuffs. As she walked down the aisle on Thomas Xander's arm, a role he had requested with gruff emotion, her eyes found Blake waiting at the altar, his expression one of undisguised adoration. The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful, with Reverend Phillips speaking eloquently of commitment and partnership. When Blake slipped his mother's pearl ring onto Josephine's finger to join the engagement ring, Thomas Xanders made no attempt to hide the tears that slipped down his weathered cheeks. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Phillips declared to the beaming congregation. "Mr. Xanders, you may kiss your bride." Blake's kiss was respectfully brief, but filled with promise, drawing cheers and applause from the assembled guests. As they turned to face the congregation, Josephine caught sight of her students in the front pews, their faces alight with excitement for their teacher's happiness. The reception at the Double X Ranch continued well into the evening, with music, dancing, and more food than even the substantial crowd could consume. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in colors reminiscent of the day they first met, Blake led Josephine away from the celebration toward the oak tree on the rise that had become their special place. "Happy, Mrs. Xanders?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "Completely," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "Though I think I'll remain Miss Nelson at the school, the children are used to it." Blake chuckled. "Whatever you prefer, my love, as long as you come home to me at the end of each day." They stood together, watching the sunset transform the landscape they both loved. The journey that had begun with a broken wagon on a lonely road had led them here to a shared future filled with promise and possibility. "I love you, Blake Xanders," Josephine said, turning in his arms to face him. "And I love you, Josephine Xanders," he replied, drawing her closer. "From now until the end of our days." Their life together unfolded with the changing seasons of the territory. Josephine continued teaching for several years, eventually training her replacement when the first of their children arrived, a daughter they named Alina, after Blake's mother. A son followed 2 years later, named Thomas for his grandfather, who doted on both grandchildren with unrestrained affection. The Double X Ranch prospered under Blake's management, expanding its operations as Arizona moved toward statehood. Josephine established the library she had dreamed of, beginning with a single bookshelf in the church, and eventually growing into a proper building on Clifton's Main Street, funded in part by the Xanders family. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Blake took Josephine back to the Hidden Valley, where he had first declared his intentions. They rode together, their children left in Martha's capable care for the day, to enjoy a private celebration of their life together. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" Josephine asked as they sat beside the spring-fed lake, unpacking the picnic Blake had prepared. "If my wagon hadn't broken that day." Blake considered the question, his hand finding hers with the easy familiarity of long marriage. "I've come to believe that some things are simply meant to be, regardless of the path. If not that day, perhaps another. But I'm grateful it was that day at that moment." "As am I," Josephine agreed, leaning against his shoulder. "Though I wouldn't wish a broken axle and a night in the wilderness on anyone else." Blake laughed, the sound echoing across the water. "It seems a small price to pay for the life we've built." "A very small price," she agreed, turning her face up to his for a kiss that held all the passion and tenderness of their years together. Their story became something of a legend in Clifton over the decades that followed how a broken wagon at Sundown had led to one of the territory's most enduring marriages. Whenever young couples faced obstacles or separation, someone would invariably remind them of Blake and Josephine Xanders, whose love story had begun with misfortune but blossomed into a lifetime of happiness. As Arizona grew and changed around them, their commitment to each other remained constant, a testament to the unexpected ways that destiny sometimes works, and to the truth that the greatest journeys often begin with a single moment of chance, or perhaps providence.